Mr. Money Mustache retired at 31 years old, and he's been helping other people do the exact same thing for the last 15 years. And that includes me. My name is Charles, and Mr. Money Mustache inspired me to begin my own journey to financial freedom, which I'm on track to reach before I turn 30 years old. I basically binge read the Mr. Money Mustache blog, so in this video, I wanted to share Mr. Money Mustache's best advice, which I've broken into 20 life-changing lessons. By the end of this video, you'll understand the principles that inspired Mr. Money Mustache to retire early, the practical steps he used to save $800,000 in just 9 years, which you can just copy, how to turn money into financial freedom and retire early, and how to live a rewarding and fulfilling life after you reach financial independence. And at the end, I'll talk about the one thing that I actually completely disagree with Mr. Money Mustache about. So you definitely want to stick around until the end. If you want a complete list of all of the Mr. Money Mustache blog posts that inspired this video, you can grab that in the video description. Lesson number 1. You're wasting everything. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average American spends 95% of their income every single year. And that's just the average. And what makes this even more insane is that whether people earn a low income or a high income, that percentage doesn't change that much. Most people spend everything they earn, no matter how much money they make. And that's why 51% of Americans who earn over $100,000 per year are still living paycheck to paycheck. That's why Mr. Money Mustache refers to the average American's lifestyle as an exploding volcano of wastefulness. It's considered normal to drive a $50,000 car and live in a big house, eat out almost every day, and to pay for streaming services to watch whenever you're bored. But it's not considered normal to just save that money and live on half of what you make. And that's why even though some people earn $30,000 per year and other people make over $300,000, the normal retirement age is still in your 60s. When people earn more money, they don't save more. They just become more wasteful. And to understand why people are so wasteful, we have to move on to lesson number 2. What do you expect? In one of Mr. Money Mustache's most recent blog posts, he talked about a trip to California. While there, he met 25-year-olds who were making $200,000 per year, but still managing to waste every penny they made. Despite living in one of the best climates in the world, everyone relied on their huge, expensive automobiles instead of just walking or biking. All of this is completely different from Mr. Money Mustache's own existence. And what he realized is that everybody lives in a bubble which we incorrectly perceive as normal. And at least in America, and a lot of other wealthy nations too, it's just considered normal to spend everything you make. And it's so normal to work until you're 65 or older that a lot of people never even question it. And even worse, our perception of normal then influences what we expect in life. If you expect to drive a fancy sports car, then a regular car will feel like a downgrade. But if you expected to have only a bicycle, then even a regular car would feel like a huge luxury. If you expect to live in a big beach house, then a regular home might not be satisfying. But if you expected to live in a tiny apartment, then even that regular home might feel enormous. And this influences how people live their lives. Most people expect to buy everything they can afford and work until their 60s. But you don't have to do the same. You can set your own expectations for life, which might prioritize financial freedom instead of just buying more stuff. And this lesson becomes extremely powerful when you combine it with the next one. Lesson number 3, stuck in the same place. There is one thing that stops almost everyone from reaching financial independence, and it's the same reason that most professional athletes go bankrupt. They think that spending more money will make them happier. But the research is actually pretty clear here. Spending more money has very little impact on your overall happiness. This is called hedonic adaptation, and Mr. Money Mustache has talked about it multiple times on his blog. Basically, no matter what situation we're in, we adapt, and we eventually return to the same level of average happiness. Things that used to feel special just become normal. We lose gratitude for the things that used to be luxuries. We just adapt to a new normal. This is why it's so freaking stupid when people say,
I don't want to deprive myself to retire early.
You aren't depriving yourself. I mean, what even counts as deprivation? When does something go from being a luxury to something that you're entitled to? You wouldn't say that you're deprived just because you can't afford to buy a yacht or a Lamborghini. That is not deprivation. But people act like $50,000 cars, $10 lattes, and $200 a month for cable TV are all necessities. Those are all luxuries too. You are not deprived without them. But when you do make all of those purchases, you are depriving yourself of something. You're depriving yourself of your time and of your freedom. You could trade all of those luxuries for your financial independence, which is exactly what Mr. Money Mustache did. Which brings us to lesson number 4. Less is more. Mr. Money Mustache disagrees with almost every other financial guru, whether that's Dave Ramsey, Tim Ferriss, or Ramit Sethi. And that's because those other gurus assume that you want to build wealth just so that you can spend even more money. But this isn't Mr. Money Mustache's approach. Even as he got richer in retirement, more on that later, he kept his expenses relatively low. The way Mr. Money Mustache explains it is most people think of frugality as this miserable existence where people are depriving themselves of things that they love just to save a few extra pennies per day. But that's not the case at all. A simpler life is even more enjoyable. And honestly, if you look at Mr. Money Mustache's finances, you'll see that he's really not that extreme. In past blog posts, Mr. Money Mustache revealed how he and his family lived on less than $25,000 per year. And if you read that blog post, which again, you can find in the top link of the video description, you'll see that Mr. Money Mustache still lives a pretty sweet life. He could spend even less money if he wanted to. So it's possible to be even happier by living a simpler and more frugal life. You have to break this association in your mind that spending more money is better. All of those lessons are most important if you're young, because of lesson number 5. Time is on your side. Most people spend everything they make in their 20s, hopefully start thinking about retirement in their 30s and 40s, get serious in their 50s and 60s, all so that they can maybe retire before they turn 70. But what if you did the opposite of that? What if you saved everything you could in your 20s, eased off the gas pedal in your 30s, and just retired in your 40s? Most people won't do that, but it's more than possible. And that's because $1 saved at 20 years old is about 15 times more powerful than a dollar saved at 60 years old. That's because money grows exponentially. If you invest $1,000 at 60 years old, it will only be $1,600 by the time you hit retirement age at 67, assuming a 7% return on investment. But if you had invested $1,000 at 20 years old, it would have grown to over $24,000. That's 15 times more than your investment at age 60. So the financial decisions that you make today are way more important than the financial decisions you make 10 years from now. This is why Mr. Money Mustache was so frugal in his 20s and why he encourages people to work hard when they're early in their careers. If you work hard and live frugally when you're young, you can have complete financial freedom for the rest of your life. But how do you actually start to save so much money and build so much wealth? Well, it's probably not how you think. So let me explain why most people's wealth building strategy doesn't work, and then I'll explain how to actually reach financial freedom and retire early. Lesson number 6. More money is not the answer. Almost every financial influencer will say,
You should get a side hustle to earn more money.
but these are massively overrated. And to prove it, Mr. Money Mustache became an Uber driver. What he found is that a lot of drivers simply underestimate the cost of driving. When he fully calculated all of the costs, he found that he was making less than minimum wage. Here's the problem with a lot of side hustles. Generally, you have to choose between two options, and neither are great. The first group of side hustles are the most common, like Uber, food delivery, and even dog walking. With these side hustles, you're just selling more of your time. They usually don't pay that well, and they're impossible to scale. If you want a side hustle with a little more potential, you can try to start your own business. These have a lot more upside, but they also have a lot more risk. For example, I've actually lost hundreds of dollars making all of the content I have. And that's not even counting the thousands of hours that I've spent making these videos and writing my newsletter. So these side hustles do have more potential, but they might not make anything. But don't get me wrong, side hustles can be massively successful. Mr. Money Mustache's own blog, for example, generated over $400,000 in just a single year. I'll need a lot more people to smash the like and subscribe button before I make even a fraction of that, but I am hoping that this YouTube channel becomes a little bit of a side hustle too. So if you want to start a side hustle, then go for it. they're just not nearly as powerful as a lot of people think. And you definitely don't need a side hustle to reach financial freedom. And that's because there's a much more powerful way to build wealth. To understand it, we have to talk about lesson number 7, the double power of saving. No matter what all the finance gurus tell you, you don't need to increase your income to reach financial freedom. And that's because spending less money is way more important than earning more money. Mr. Money Mustache explains why in his blog post titled The Shockingly Simple Math Behind Early Retirement. Basically, whenever you earn more money, you're a few dollars closer to financial freedom. But if you reduce your expenses, 2 things happen. First, you'll have more money in savings. Whether you increase your income by $10,000 or just reduce your expenses by $10,000, you'll be $10,000 closer to early retirement. But second, by reducing your expenses, you magically need way less money to retire. If I can live on $50,000 per year, then I obviously don't need as much money to retire as someone who spends $100,000 per year. This is why frugality is so much more important than having a high income. If you can reduce your expenses, then you'll be saving way more money per year, and you'll need way less money to be financially independent. This is great news, because saving more money is super easy. So let's move on to lesson number 8, $1,000 per hour. In one of his blog posts, Mr. Money Mustache talks about how to make $1,000 per hour. In that blog post, Mr. Money Mustache sits down with one of his friends who is spending $20,000 per year just on insurance and debt payments. By taking just 2 hours to look for better rates, Mr. Money Mustache helped his friend save an extra $6,000 every single year. Saving more money is so much easier than making more money. Most people would have to switch jobs and completely change their lives to make an extra $6,000 per year. But Mr. Money Mustache helped his friend do that by just making a few phone calls. And by saving an extra $6,000 per year, this person also needs way less money to retire, like we just talked about. And we haven't even talked about investing, which will make those savings even more powerful. Saving more money is easy, and these savings are absolutely everywhere, which brings us to lesson number 9. It's the little things. Reading Mr. Money Mustache's blog might be better than doubling your income, and I'll prove that to you in a second, but first let's talk about some of the many ways to save more money. Many of Mr. Money Mustache's blog posts dive into this, whether it's cutting his own hair, brewing his own coffee, optimizing his electricity bill, or investing in his own workout equipment. As Mr. Money Mustache says, a millionaire is made $10 at a time, and this is just scratching the surface of all of the different ways that you could reduce your expenses. Do all of these little expenses actually make that much of a difference? Well, yeah, they do. In Mr. Money Mustache's blog post titled, "Is this blog more powerful than doubling your salary?" he shared a story of a reader who started to dramatically increase their net worth after discovering his blog. What's crazy is that this reader had doubled their income just a few months before, but it barely made a difference. But what did make a difference is a bunch of very small purchases that all added up to a lot of money. So do not ignore your small expenses, especially the ones that you make very frequently. These changes alone can make a huge difference. But if you really want to supercharge your net worth and reach financial freedom, then we need to talk about lesson number 10, how to save a lot of money. Size matters, and if you want to save big money, you have to look at your biggest expenses. And if you're like the average American, your largest expenses are probably housing, transportation, and food. Probably in that order. Mr. Money Mustache has talked about how to save money on each of these. I don't have the time to go into detail on all of these different things, so again, make sure to click the top link in the video description, and I'll send you all of the blog posts where he talks about this. For housing, Mr. Money Mustache actually spends a lot more money than he needs to, which he's admitted. But if you read his guide on how to buy a house, you could spend a lot less. He also wrote a blog post on how to sell a house, which you should definitely read if you get to that point. And while he didn't do it himself, Mr. Money Mustache has also shared how one of his friends used house hacking to semi-retire at just 27 years old. And since Mr. Money Mustache bought a house very early in his career, he doesn't talk about renting much. If you're interested in how to save a lot of money on rent, you might want to check out my own video on that. Let's move on to transportation, which is one of Mr. Money Mustache's favorite topics. He's even said before that the biggest factor leading to his low cost of living was by riding a bike rather than by buying a second car. And driving a car is a lot more expensive than most people think, which Mr. Money Mustache explained in his blog post about the true cost of commuting. And this is one of the reasons that riding a bicycle can save you an insane amount of money. Mr. Money Mustache even estimated the savings to be over $100,000 over 10 years. Lastly, there's food. This is honestly one of the easiest ways to save money, and Mr. Money Mustache breaks down exactly how to eat well while also saving money in this blog post. You definitely want to check this one out. And all of these savings become so much easier when you understand lesson number 11, the cha-ching instinct. If you want to retire early, you have to rewire your brain. Because here's the problem. Most people get excited when they buy new stuff, but that high wears off quickly. So they buy even more stuff, which is not sustainable. That's why Mr. Money Mustache talks about the cha-ching instinct. Instead of getting excited when you spend money, you should get excited when you save money. Whenever you avoid a stupid purchase or find a new way to reduce your expenses even more, that's when you should get excited. Being able to invest those savings is so much cooler than buying new useless crap. If all of this talk of living frugally sounds miserable and extreme, then you need to understand lesson number 12. Life is still luxurious. This lesson actually comes from one of my favorite blog posts from Mr. Money Mustache, so I do hope you read the entire thing. People have accused Mr. Money Mustache of being extremely frugal and over the top. They think that he's deprived himself to reach financial independence. But that's not the case at all. Even after retiring, Mr. Money Mustache started to earn even more money. But even so, he started to spend even less money. It's not that he needed to save more money, it's just that he was already living the most rewarding and fulfilling life that he could, which happens to cost very little. And frankly, as Mr. Money Mustache points out, he still has luxury after luxury. He didn't sacrifice anything that's that important. He just prioritized his own health, his own freedom, and his own fulfillment. So if you've followed along so far, you'll be saving a ton more money without being deprived or miserable. But to actually convert those savings into financial freedom, you have to understand lesson number 13, what it takes to retire. You can retire when your money is growing faster than you spend it. At this point, you don't need to trade any more of your time for money because you already have enough. So that leads us to a really important question. How fast does money grow? And this depends on a lot of factors, but for simplicity, let's assume you invest in low-cost index funds or exchange-traded funds that track the stock market. At least historically, the stock market has returned about 10% per year. So can you withdraw 10% of your portfolio every year? Absolutely not. For one, once you account for inflation, the average return of the stock market is closer to 7%. And then it's probably smart to have a buffer. So it's considered much safer to withdraw 3 to 4% of your portfolio every year. In other words, if you have $1 million invested, you can probably retire early as long as you spend less than $40,000 per year. This is just an estimate though. I actually made a whole video where I explain some of the nuances and caveats in a lot more detail, and you can also find more detail in Mr. Money Mustache's blog post linked in the description. But as a simple rule of thumb, you just need 25 times your annual expenses to retire early. And that also explains lesson number 14, why you want the stock market to crash. A stock market crash is absolutely awesome news, and let me tell you why. As I said earlier, the stock market has returned about 7% per year after adjustment for inflation. If you zoom in, you'll see that the stock market is anything but predictable. In some years, it loses 10%, in other years, it goes up by 25%. This is why Mr. Money Mustache thinks it's awesome news whenever the stock market crashes. If you can invest after a big dip, you're almost guaranteed to have a higher return on your investment. A stock market crash just means all of your favorite investments are on sale. That isn't such a bad thing. Even if you aren't able to benefit from dips in the stock market, you'll still probably benefit from lesson number 15, getting rich in retirement. Most people worry about running out of money in retirement, But if you only withdraw 4% of your portfolio, like we just talked about, then it's actually far more likely that you'll become even wealthier after you quit your job. In Mr. Money Mustache's blog post titled First Retire, Then Get Rich, he explains how this could happen. For one, you might see your expenses decrease in retirement, as Mr. Money Mustache did, so you'd have saved more than you need to. And second, you could also make a few extra bucks through fun side projects. But even if you don't do any of that, you'll still probably end up wealthier. And that's because, as Mr. Money Mustache says, your money can work harder than you can. And since the stock market has averaged 7% per year, it will likely exceed the 4% that you're withdrawing. As long as the stock market doesn't crash as soon as you quit your job, then your wealth will continue to grow, which means you'll get even richer after quitting your job. Whenever we try to predict the future, we also have to understand lesson number 16. Control what you can. Mr. Money Mustache has helped a lot of people take control of their finances and of their lives. But he also recognizes that there are some things that are out of our control. And that's why Mr. Money Mustache encourages people to think about what's in your circle of control versus what's in your circle of concern. You might be worried about the stock market, possible layoffs, and whether lightning will strike your house and cause it to burn down. You probably can't control those things, so what's the use in worrying about it? What you can control is how much money you spend, how hard you work, and whether you have house insurance or not. And this is really all part of Mr. Money Mustache's philosophy of Stoicism. Stoicism is an ancient philosophy that I'm not going to completely try to explain here. But a core theme of Stoicism is that there's no use worrying about things that you can't control. It doesn't help to wish things were different. You just have to make the best of what reality is. So by now, you know everything you need to know to reach financial freedom and retire early. So let's talk about how to enjoy early retirement. Because the truth is, some people hate it. Lesson number 17. Hating retirement. Early retirement can absolutely suck. And that's because financial freedom just means that you don't have to do work. But what do you do then? Mr. Money Mustache showed a reader's story in this post, where they shared how miserable they became after they retired at 26 years old. What they learned is that if you're financially free, you don't have to do anything. But doing nothing isn't actually that fun. So before you reach financial freedom yourself, you should really think about what you want to do after. And what you might realize is that you don't even need to be financially free to do the things that you want to do. And sometimes the things you want to do might even involve more work, even if it's not the job that you're doing right now. Work can be really good for you. To see why, we need to talk about lesson number 18, the comfort crisis. Most people think they'll enjoy life when it's easier, so they reach financial freedom so they don't have to do anything. What's easier than doing nothing? But the problem is, according to Mr. Money Mustache and a growing body of research, doing something is actually really good for you. Mr. Money Mustache talked about this in one of his recent blog posts, titled The Comfort Crisis. In that blog post, Mr. Money Mustache talked about how doing hard work can actually be extremely rewarding. And you can see this philosophy throughout the Mr. Money Mustache blog, which is filled with do-it-yourself projects and fun challenges. The blog itself is a testament to Mr. Money Mustache's desire to create something. So reaching financial freedom is still really important because it lets you do the work that really matters to you, even if that work doesn't pay. But doing some work is probably good for you. And this is another reason that you'll probably become even wealthier in retirement. Which brings us to one of Mr. Money Mustache's most important lessons. Lesson number 19. What to do with your millions. A shockingly common piece of advice is that you should pass away with nothing to your name. You should try to spend every penny you've ever made while you're still alive. The theory is that spending more money will make you happier, which we've already debunked. But that does raise a really important question. What do you do with all of your extra money? This was a question that Mr. Money Mustache had to answer, especially as he saw his wealth grow in retirement. And his solution was effective altruism. Most people want to invest their money in the most effective way possible. Everybody would prefer a 10% return on investment instead of a 3% return on investment. But what's interesting is that most people don't think this way when it comes to charitable giving. They just give their money based on emotions instead of trying to maximize the impact they have. But Mr. Money Mustache wanted to optimize his charitable impact in the same way that he optimized everything else in his life. And that's why almost all of his donations go to the most effective charities in the world, like those selected by GiveWell. But the real point is that you don't need to spend all of that money on yourself. Those millions can save hundreds of lives. And all of this is part of a much bigger point, which is lesson number 20, finding purpose. The Mr. Money Mustache blog isn't really about money. It's about living the most rewarding life that you possibly can. And that life doesn't require spending a lot of money. To truly find happiness, you just need to focus on family, freedom, and community. These are all core themes of the Mr. Money Mustache blog. Buying more crap that you don't need is so much less important than having the time to focus on what really matters. Each of these lessons from Mr. Money Mustache changed my life, which is why I wanted to share them with you. And that's also why I made a video guide that's linked in the video description that has all of the blog posts that I referenced. But that doesn't mean that I agree with everything Mr. Money Mustache says. In fact, there is one thing that Mr. Money Mustache has talked about that I would never personally advise anyone to do. Because it turns out, Mr. Money Mustache doesn't have health insurance. But I understand that health insurance in America is extremely expensive, and it is true that you'll probably pay more money into insurance than you'll get out of it. So I kind of get it. But health insurance companies can afford to cover the huge catastrophic expenses that you might not be able to. So I understand why Mr. Money Mustache has made the decision he has, but I would never recommend to one of my coaching clients that they do the same. I would recommend at least having a high deductible insurance plan just in case something really bad happens. But look, I know that reaching financial freedom can still feel impossible, especially if you don't have a high-paying job in the tech industry like Mr. Money Mustache did. But I think it's a lot easier than most people realize. And to prove it, I made an entire video where I showed how an average couple could realistically retire early in their 40s, and maybe even faster than that. So you definitely want to check out that video next, and I'm going to link it right here.